October 7th, 1542. Just after dawn off the coast of an unknown land, the San Salvador, a creaking, sea-worn Spanish carrack, wallowed in a heavy Pacific swell. Aboard her, the scent of brine, tar, and the pervasive smell of unwashed men and wet livestock clung to the air. At the rail, his knuckles white on the sun-bleached wood, stood Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, a Portuguese explorer in the service of the Spanish crown. His leathery face, etched with the lines of a dozen such voyages, was tense with a specific, weary anticipation. He was not looking for a new world. He was looking for a passage through it, the mythical Strait of Anion, a shortcut to the Atlantic. Beside him, the pilot Bartolomé Ferrer called out soundings in a low voice, the leadsman's hemp line whizzing through his hands. "Dez brazas, fondo de arena," 10 fathoms, sandy bottom. The coast ahead was a jagged line of ochre cliffs and dense, dark green brush, utterly silent and impossibly vast. Cabrillo's orders from the Viceroy of New Spain were clear. Sail north, map the coast, find wealth, and claim the land. But as he watched the unfamiliar seabirds wheel against a cloud-streaked sky, he felt the weight of a deeper, unspoken truth. This land was not empty. Through his prized Lombard glass, he scanned the shoreline. His eye caught movement, thin plumes of smoke, not from volcanoes but from hearths rising from sheltered coves. The land was already speaking, already lived upon. The men on deck, hardened soldiers, soldados and sailors, marineros in patched doublets, muttered prayers and gripped their arquebuses. They were not pioneers on a virgin frontier. They were interlopers on the doorstep of a world that had thrived for millennia. The history of California was not beginning with the San Salvador's arrival. It was continuing, and Cabrillo's voyage was about to become a violent, awkward footnote in a much longer story. The real tale was already written in the footprints on those distant beaches, in the fishing weirs in the kelp beds, and in the watchful eyes hidden among the trees, observing the strange house of wood as it drifted closer to their home. 2 days later, on October 9th, the San Salvador and its smaller consort, the Victoria, lay at anchor in a broad, sheltered bay Cabrillo would name San Miguel. His longboat ground onto the coarse sand of what we now call San Diego. Cabrillo, in full polished breastplate and burgonet helmet, stepped ashore, the heavy Spanish flag borne aloft by a standard beeper. A party of 24 armored men followed, their boots alien and heavy on the continent. They were met not by an empty beach, but by a group of the Cunii people. The Cunii stood firm, armed with bows and spears tipped with razor-sharp obsidian. They did not flee. They communicated through gesture and tone, a clear boundary being set. For a tense hour, a fragile, silent trade occurred, glass beads and pieces of polished brass for fresh water and fish. But the Spanish worldview could not accommodate equals. The concept of encomienda, the right to extract tribute and labor, was already in Cabrillo's mind. When a young soldado, Pedro de Alarcón, agitated and perhaps frightened, moved to seize a woven basket without offering a trade, the line was crossed. A Cunii warrior shouted, drawing his bow. In a flash, the Spanish crossbows thrummed. An arquebus coughed smoke and thunder, its lead ball finding a target in the dense brush. The first recorded violent death of a Californian by European hands was not in a grand battle, but in a skittish, brutal moment of misunderstanding and imperial presumption. The Cunii melted into the landscape, a tactical withdrawal that left the Spanish alone on the beach, the echo of the gunshot hanging in the air. No gold was found, no strait was discovered, only a grim precedent was set. Cabrillo would continue north, mapping the coastline, naming places for saints and feast days, encountering the Chumash in their magnificent Tamal canoes. He would die months later from an infected wound suffered in a skirmish on the Channel Islands, be buried in an unmarked grave. But the name he had given this entire stretch of coast, pulled from a popular Spanish romance novel of the time, would endure: California. A mythical island of gold and Amazons, a fantasy name slapped onto a complex living reality. The true story was not one of discovery, but of imposition, of a legend overwriting a land. Forget the coast for a moment. Travel inland to the year 1772 into the vast, sun-scorched heart of the San Joaquin Valley. Here the air shimmers with heat, carrying the scent of dry grass, sage, and distant water. This is Yocut's land. Sergeant Jose Francisco Ortega, a leather-tough veteran of Portola's earlier expeditions, leads a scouting party of 16 soldiers from the newly established mission San Luis Obispo. They are searching for runaway neophytes, native people who had fled the mission's harsh discipline. What they find stops them in their tracks. Before them stretches an empire the Spanish never imagined, not of stone and steel, but of grass and reed. A vast, bustling network of villages lined the sloughs and rivers. They saw dome-shaped houses, hunj, that could hold 50 people, constructed from tule reeds that rose from the wetlands like natural cathedrals. The Yokuts were not simple nomads. They were master hydraulic engineers. They built intricate canals and weirs to manage water for irrigation and to trap fish, creating a sustainable, abundant food system in what the Spanish would dismiss as a desert. Their population was immense, likely in the tens of thousands in the valley alone. Ortega and his men on their tired horses were seen not as gods or even primary threats, but as curiosities and perhaps harbingers. A Yokuts chief whom the Spanish would record as El Buchan due to a prominent goiter approached with dignified authority. Through fractured signs, he made it clear the runaways were under his protection. This was sovereign territory. The Spanish muskets and crucifixes held little power here. The real power was in the thousands of eyes watching from the Tule breaks, in the knowledge of this land that ran deeper than any Spanish map. Ortega, outnumbered and leagues from any support, had no choice but to withdraw. This encounter was a stark revelation. Spanish California was a fragile coastal fringe, a series of dusty presidios and missions clinging to the shore. The true California, an inland sea of independent nations and complex societies, remained largely untouched and unconquered. The mission system's reach was a shallow shadow. The heart of the land still beat to its own ancient rhythm. November 20th, 1818. The thick fog that blanketed Monterey Bay did not roll in from the sea. It was gunsmoke. The fortified Presidio of Monterey, the capital of Spanish Alta California, was under direct, relentless cannon fire. But the colors snapping in the coastal wind above the attacking ships were not those of a rival European empire. They were the pale blue and white of the Republic of Buenos Aires, a privateer vessel, the Argentina, commanded by the French-born pirate Hippolyte de Bouchard. Inside the Presidio walls, Governor Pablo Vicente de Solá scrambled his outnumbered garrison. The Spanish had weathered Russian fur trappers and British explorers, but this was a full-scale assault by a revolutionary force fighting for the independence of Spanish colonies. As Bouchard's 200-strong landing force, a motley crew of South Americans, Europeans, and Hawaiians, swarmed the beaches, the local Californio population and the Mission Indians did not rally to Spain's defense. Many simply withdrew watching. Some saw not an invasion but a potential liberation. The fight was brutal but brief. The Presidio was sacked, the royal warehouses plundered. For 2 days, Bouchard held the capital of California. He issued proclamations, not in the name of a king, but of republicanism and freedom from Spanish rule. His was a pirate flag, yes, but it carried an ideological virus deadlier to the empire than cannon shot: the idea of self-determination. Before sailing south to raid Mission San Juan Capistrano, Bouchard left Monterey in flames. But the greater fire he lit was in the minds of the Californios, the native-born descendants of earlier Spanish settlers. They had witnessed the vulnerability of their distant overlords. The myth of Spanish invincibility had burned with the Presidio's timbers. The event was a crack in the colonial facade, a preview of the power vacuum to come. California was not just a distant province. It was a prize, now openly visible to outsiders, and its own people had begun to question the chain of command that stretched all the way to a weakened Madrid. To understand the true conquest of California, look not to the battles you've heard of, but to the ones waged silently, in the soil and in the blood. The year is 1806 at Mission San Francisco de Asís, known as Mission Dolores. A Spanish friar, painstakingly recording the mission's census, dips his quill in iron gall ink. He notes the baptism of 20 new neophytes from the nearby Bay Miwok villages. He does not, however, record the other new arrivals that came on the same supply ship from Mexico, European rats hiding in the grain sacks, and the seeds of invasive European grasses, foxtail and wild oat, tangled in the fodder and the hems of soldiers' uniforms. These were the true agents of empire. The rats ravaged the carefully stored seed caches of the native communities, undermining their food security. European grasses spread with a terrifying speed, their deep root systems and quick life cycles outcompeting the native bunch grasses that sustained the local Tule elk and pronghorn antelope. The landscape itself began to change, shifting from a diverse, perennial grassland to a monoculture of annuals that died back in the summer, creating the perfect tinder for devastating new wildfires. And then came the invisible armies. In 1833, a mission child at Santa Clara spiked a fever. It was measles. The disease, a common childhood illness in Europe, exploded through the densely packed, malnourished Mission Indian populations with the force of a biological wildfire. They had no immunity. Communities that had survived for millennia were hollowed out in weeks. The death was so swift and so total that it often outpaced the friar's ability to record it. Graveyards filled faster than baptisteries. This was not the dramatic clash of swords, but a quiet, demographic apocalypse. By the time the Mexican era ended and the American period began, the original peoples of California had been reduced to a fraction of their former number by these unseen vectors of change, seeds, rodents, and viruses, the deadliest cargo the ships from the Old World ever carried. January 5th, 1860. The dense redwood fog of the Mendocino coast clung to the men of the 6th U.S. Infantry as they advanced in a skirmish line through the dripping ferns. They were not fighting Confederates. The Civil War was still a year away. Their enemy was the Yahi people, and their commander was a man whose name would be erased from California's triumphant narratives, Lieutenant Colonel, Brevet Brigadier General John C. H. Yellowstone Kelly. This was the culmination of the so-called Mendocino War and the Mill Creek War, a brutal, protracted campaign of extermination that represented the final, bloody chapter of the state's original conquest. For 2 years, Kelly had pursued a policy of total war against the remaining independent native groups in the northern Sierras and coastal ranges. His tactics were systematic and brutal. Winter campaigns when families were most vulnerable. The burning of food caches, acorn granaries, and dried salmon stores. The poisoning of water holes with strychnine. The offering of bounties for scalps, a practice local settlers embraced with gruesome enthusiasm. The reports filed at Fort Turwaugh and Fort Humboldt are sterile in their horror. Engaged hostiles, 34 killed, 2 captured, villages destroyed. On this January morning, Kelly's troops cornered a band of Yahi at a place called Deer Creek. The ensuing fight was a massacre. When the smoke cleared, only a handful of Yahi escaped into the trackless labyrinth of Mill Creek Canyon. Among the survivors was a young boy who would, years later, become known to the world as Ishi, the last wild Indian of North America. His entire world, his family, and his people had been methodically destroyed not by pioneers, but by the official, organized military power of the state of California and the U.S. Army, under the command of a forgotten general. This was not the lawless frontier. It was a sanctioned, bureaucratic genocide, conducted after statehood, ensuring the gold-rich hills and fertile valleys were utterly and tragically clear for the taking. The story they taught you begins here, January 24, 1848 at Sutter's Mill. James W. Marshall picks a gleaming fleck from the mill race, but let us pull the camera back from that iconic moment. See the wider frame. The land under Sutter's Mill was not John Sutter's. It was part of the vast, contested Mexican land grant of Rancho Nueva Helvetia. The workers building the mill were not eager pioneers. They were Mormon battalion veterans and members of the local Nisenan and Miwok tribes, whose ancestral home this was. The gold Marshall found did not spark a rush. It was a secret Sutter, and Marshall tried desperately to keep, knowing it would destroy Sutter's agrarian empire. The secret leaked. And what followed was not a heroic migration, but the largest, swiftest invasion by water in human history. By 1849, San Francisco Bay was a forest of masts, hundreds of ships abandoned by crews and captains alike who sprinted for the hills. But this is the myth. The untold story is what the gold rush truly was, an engine of ecological and human catastrophe. The 49ers did not just dig in riverbeds, they invented hydraulic mining. By the 1850s, massive cannons, monitors, were blasting mountainsides with jets of water powerful enough to cut through solid rock. Rivers ran thick as sludge with mercury and arsenic used to process ore. Prime agricultural valleys to the north, like Nevada City's Humbug Creek, were buried under 30 feet of toxic debris. The sediment-choked rivers destroyed salmon runs and flooded farmland all the way to the Sacramento Delta. And the law? It was the law of the claim and the whip. While the myth celebrates the lonely prospector, the reality was industrialized extraction controlled by syndicates. And for the Californios who held old Spanish and Mexican land grants, the gold rush brought the lawyer's rush. A maze of American courts, the Land Act of 1851, and outright squatting stripped them of their estates, legalizing a second conquest under the guise of paperwork. The Golden State was not built on gold, but on stolen land, poisoned waters, and a legalized theft that transformed a pastoral Californio society into a subordinate class in a single avaricious generation. The gold was a stain, and its glitter still blinds us to the violence of its wake. The history they never taught you does not end with a neat conclusion. It whispers in the dry wind that blows through the Owens Valley, where the water once flowed. It lingers in the foundation stones of Sunken City in San Pedro, where a neighborhood built on stolen Palos Verdes land slid into the sea. It echoes in the forgotten dialects of the Yukian languages, spoken by people who lived north of the bay for thousands of years, now silenced. California's story is not one of inevitable progress, but of layers, layers of human experience, conflict, and resilience stacked one upon the other. The Cunei who watched Cabrillo's ship are still there, fighting for federal recognition and the protection of their sacred sites. The descendants of the Californios see their family names on street signs in cities that no longer belong to them. The ghost of General Kelly's war lives on in the struggles of the Pitt River tribe to reclaim their ancestral waters. To know this history is to see the state with new eyes. Every major city sits atop a former village. Every freeway follows an old indigenous trade route or Spanish camino real. The wealth that built its institutions is rooted in extracted gold, seized land, and exploited labor. This is not a history of shame, but one of depth and complexity. It is a testament to the cultures that endured the silent conquests and the violent ones, and who are still here, shaping the future. The untold history is, finally, the only one that makes the present make sense. It is the key to understanding the fractures and the beauty of this place, not as a golden dream, but as a living, contested, and profoundly human ground.